Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our program this evening called Partners in Progress, which will be a illuminating LGBTQ plus history at Eleanor Roosevelt's cottage in Val-Kill. And before I introduce the speaker to you, I want to note that 3 other libraries have joined Pound Ridge in presenting this program to you, and they are New Rochelle, Chappaqua, and Yonkers. So we all welcome you, and I would like to present to you our guide, Danielle Massaro, who is a leader and guide at the historic site in close to, as I just learned tonight, to the Roosevelt home. And anyway, Danielle is going to enlighten us about a chapter in our history, which we don't know too much about. At least I don't, and I'm sure many of us don't. So I'm going to just pass it on to you, Danny. And if you'd like to get started, that would be great. Danny?
Yes, absolutely. So my name, yes, is Danielle Mastero. Everyone calls me Danny. And I'm a park ranger at the Roosevelt Vanderbilt National Historic Site in Hyde Park. So I work at the park there, which includes a number of sites. We have the home of Franklin Roosevelt, the home of Eleanor Roosevelt, the Vanderbilt Mansion National Historic Site, as well as Top Cottage, which was Franklin Roosevelt's retreat. And so the National Park Service manages all of those sites under the purview of the Roosevelt Vanderbilt National Historic Sites. So I give tours and deliver programs on all regarding all of those sites. And Val-Kill, the home of Eleanor Roosevelt, is a site that when it's open, I can often be found there. We're open at Val-Kill in the late spring and summer and fall months, and then we close at the end of October for a number of months until the beginning of May, or the middle of May, usually, when our summer seasonal staff comes on. But the grounds are open year round. So during those times when Val-Kill is closed, I'll give tours at the home of Franklin Roosevelt and the Vanderbilt Mansion. But Val-Kill is a very special place. It has a special place in my heart. It's one of the reasons that I really wanted to come work for the Park Service. And so I feel very fortunate that I am here with everybody today, delivering this program, which I think is a really important one. I think it's a topic that is really important to us, something that the National Park Service is really trying to prioritize. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, about what our goals are regarding inclusivity in these sites, in public history sites, such as the home of Eleanor Roosevelt. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that to get us started. So I'm going to start my slideshow here. So let me kind of get started. So as I said, my name is Danny. So at the end of the program today, we will open it up to a Q&A and any questions or comments or stories that anybody wants to share. And so in the meantime, I think what we're going to do is have folks put some questions in the chat. And so like I was saying, the Park Service, the National Park Service, which is a federal government entity, is really invested in sharing these stories. We are trying to kind of fill in the gaps in our knowledge in the stories that in many cases over the years have been de-emphasized. They have been sometimes erased. And the reasons why these things happen are, there's a myriad of reasons of why these things happen, but in many cases, primary sources are missing for some of the stories talking about people that we would consider today to be members of the LGBTQ community. They may not have identified, in many cases would not have identified themselves as such during their time period for a number of reasons, some of which I'm sure we're familiar with, thinking about the stigmas that were attached to people who were living outside of social norms and accepted standards at the time. And so in many cases, those stories have been sometimes either ignored or in some cases are absent. These stories are absent for the narrative. And so we're trying to reinsert them, basically to highlight these stories and use the resources that we have, in some cases that are a kind of in some ways kind of hiding in plain sight, so that we can understand the lives that people were living, which were so full and diverse, you know, really throughout history. These people that are members, as I said, of these communities that today we would refer to as LGBTQ members of our community have always been present. They've always been in part of our history. And so we're trying to tell these stories because of that. So thinking about the stories such as that we're going to be talking about today, the people who were involved in the story at Val-Kill, the people that were involved in Eleanor Roosevelt's life and in the history of her home at Val-Kill in Hyde Park. We're hoping to provide people with the context. So giving people the information that we have about their lives, the things that they did, the things that they accomplished, the way that they impacted the story of Val-Kill, and how Eleanor Roosevelt and Val-Kill impacted them. I think that we are giving people the context so that they can draw their own conclusions. We're not here to try to tell people that these are the ways that we must feel about these stories, or that we must assign, labels to people's lives and to their identities that they may not have themselves used for themselves. But we're here to tell people about their lives, and so that you can understand their lives through that context and draw your own conclusions as to what their lives must have been like. And so that's what we're really trying to accomplish in doing programs like this, telling these stories and inviting people to places like Val-Kill to share these stories. And we want everybody to feel included in history. We want everybody in our world today to feel like they can go to a place like Val-Kill, which is so historically significant and meaningful, and to be able to see themselves in those stories. And so those are our goals in doing this. And so we have a photograph on the screen right now of 4 women. And so the 3 of them are women that we're going to be talking about a lot today. And so from the right, we're talking about Marion Dickerman and Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, Nancy Cook. And so Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman were life partners. They met in 1912 in Syracuse when they went to Syracuse University together. And then the woman all the way to the left, the younger woman, is Marion Dickerman's sister. And so they're here. I love this picture because it's women wearing pants at a time when that would not necessarily have been something that was common. And you can see they're having a great time. The women all would have, driven automobiles. They would have, been able to kind of go out and do the things that they were trying to accomplish in this way. And so you can kind of get a sense of that by looking at the ways that they lived outside of societal conventions and norms, by even just wearing pants, which would not have been something that was necessarily that common back then.
Excuse me, Danny, just for a minute, It's Marilyn. Apparently not everyone is muted, and I don't hear any background noise, but apparently some of our participants do. So if either Jennifer, you can mute everybody, or with everybody just mute themselves so no one hears any back noise. Thank you.
Yeah, I have been hearing a little of that. I think there is a way to mute everybody.
I did. You're all set.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. I know sometimes we forget to mute ourselves. I do the same thing sometimes when I'm participating in a presentation like this. So as I was saying, we will have some time for questions at the end for everybody that's participating and interested in that. So we're going to start out by talking a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt herself and her life, and really what her life looks like at the beginning of her life. And then my goal is to really help people understand how her life was changed and shaped and influenced by the people in her life. We so often talk about, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, her husband, and the other aspects of her life, how she's influenced by things like that in her life. But there are many people that were important to her in her life. And she always said that it was her friends that helped her become who she became. And so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt's life and the beginning. And so she was born in New York City on October 11th, 1884. She was the daughter of Anna and Elliot Roosevelt, who we can see on the screen here. And Anna Hall Roosevelt passed away when Eleanor Roosevelt was 8 years old. And so she had not a very close relationship with her mother. She always felt kind of detached from her mother, who seemed to be closer with Eleanor's brothers, who we can see on the bottom of the screen, Elliot Jr. and Hall Roosevelt. So Elliot Jr. passed away shortly after Anna did, and Hall was the only sibling that Eleanor had that survived to adulthood. And so her father, Elliot Roosevelt, who we see pictured with Eleanor, adored Eleanor, and Eleanor also adored her father. He was someone who unfortunately was afflicted by alcoholism. And so this was something that really impacted Eleanor Roosevelt. She, throughout her life, felt very strongly about alcohol and drinking to excess because of her experiences with her father when she was growing up. And unfortunately, her brother Hall, who, as I said, was her sibling that survived to adulthood, did also pass away from the effects of alcoholism in 1941. And so we have these sort of tragic losses in the beginning of Eleanor Roosevelt's life. And so she's an orphan by the age of 10 and raised by her grandmother, her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt's mother, raised Eleanor in the Hudson Valley in a town called Tivoli, which is about 20 miles away from Val-Kill. And so she was raised in this world that was very traditional. She was raised to believe that men and women had these sort of separate spheres in this time period, where women were raised to believe, particularly women of that socioeconomic class, were raised to believe that the women's sphere was the home, raising the family, raising the children, taking care of the home. And so this is what Eleanor Roosevelt was raised to believe. Her grandmother Hall was very traditional. She was actually a very young grandmother when she took over the raising of Eleanor and her brother Hall. She herself was only in her 40s, and she had a number of Anna's sisters who were still themselves quite young, that she was still, raising at that time. So Eleanor grew up in this household and was raised to believe that she would grow up to follow in the example of her grandmother Hall. And so when we think about the things that Eleanor Roosevelt does later on in her life, and the way that she steps outside of these more traditional roles, it's an interesting transformation, and we're going to be talking about that today. So her grandmother sent Eleanor to Allenswood Academy in England, which is just outside of London, when Eleanor turned 15. So between the ages of 15 to 18, she attended Allenswood, which was a school run by a woman named Marie Souvestre, Madame Souvestre, as she was called. And she was a very progressive feminist French woman. She had owned earlier and run a school in France that one of Eleanor's relatives had attended. And so because of this, they decided to send Eleanor to Allenswood, a new school that Marie Souvestre had started in London, outside of London. And Eleanor loved being at Allenswood. Those 3 years that she spent at Allenswood were very formative ones for her. She said much that she became later in her life had its foundation around this time, these 3 years at Allenswood, what she called the 3 happiest years of her life. And she wanted to continue her education. She was learning about so many new things at Allenswood related to the ideas of social justice, civil responsibilities, personal independence. She was traveling with Marie Souvestre during school vacations and being given the opportunity for the first time to handle money and make hotel and train reservations and spend time shopping on her own. So this was a really transformative time in her life. But after 3 years, her grandmother said that 3 years was enough education, and that it was time for Eleanor to come back to the United States to make her social debut, which is what she did at the age of 18. And so this is something that she would have been expected to do. And although it wasn't what she wanted to continue her education and go to college. And she also always felt that lack throughout her life, the lack of attending college. This is what she was compelled to do at this time. And we can see some photographs on the screen from this time period. This is Eleanor on the top with some of her Allenswood classmates. We can see Eleanor in the top row, second from the right. And then Marie Souvestre, her great teacher and the woman who owned Allenswood Academy, is pictured on the bottom right. And Eleanor had that picture of Marie Souvestre on her bedside table until Eleanor passed away in 1962. And that was really, as I said, a really important time for her, a very important person for her. And Marie Souvestre passed away when Eleanor was, when the year that she was married to Franklin Roosevelt in 1905. She died of cancer, but she never forgot Marie Souvestre. And she wrote about her often in her My Day newspaper column later on and in her autobiographies. So as we've been talking about, Eleanor is really growing up and being reared in this very traditional environment. And she will marry Franklin Roosevelt, her 5th cousin once removed, when Eleanor is 20. And so Franklin Roosevelt is 2 years older than her. And they're married in 1905 in New York City. They are married. When they are married, Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's uncle, walks her down the aisle in the absence of her father, who has passed away. And between the years of 1906 and 1916, Eleanor gives birth to 6 children. So they have 6 children together. Although they lost one of their sons in infancy, the first Franklin Jr. passed away at the age of 7 months. They will raise 5 children together, 1 daughter and 4 sons. And we can see a photograph on the lower right of their family. And when they are raising this family, they're living with Franklin's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. And if you know anything about Sarah Delano, she was a very strong-willed person. She was in charge of the household in the places where Eleanor and Franklin are living and raising their children. And she had a lot of very strong ideas and opinions about her household and the way things would be conducted there. And so Eleanor Roosevelt really never felt at home in these places. So we can see from the photographs kind of, again, this very traditional role for her at the time, which she is, she accepts. This is something that she knows that she is supposed to do. And she is at home, as she says, raising the children. For the first 10 years of their marriage, she said she was always either having a baby or just getting over having a baby. And we can see on the screen a quote where she says that, "I suppose I was fitting pretty well into the pattern of a fairly conventional, quiet young society matron." And she, at this time, was, relatively satisfied with this life. This is what she knew that was something that was, she was meant to do. But a number of things happen over the years, really from the 19-teens into the early 1920s, that begin to open up new avenues for Eleanor Roosevelt, new avenues of thought and perspective and opportunities. And so Franklin, after their marriage, goes on to become, of course, a politician. He becomes a state senator of New York in 1911, and will go on to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. And during this time, Eleanor and Franklin will move and live in places like Albany when he's a state senator. They'll move to Washington when he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And so Eleanor does have some independence at these times. She is in charge of the household in the places where they're living when he is holding these government positions. But when they return to Springwood, to the big house, as the family called the Roosevelt home, her mother-in-law will be in charge of these places. And we see a photograph on the top right here of the Roosevelt family at Campobello, which was the Roosevelt summer estate in Canada across from Lubec, Maine. And so we can see Eleanor and Franklin, and then in between them, her mother-in-law, Sarah Roosevelt. And so we can see her hand, Sarah's hand on Eleanor's knee at this time. And this photograph was taken after Eleanor discovered an affair between Franklin Roosevelt, her husband, and the woman on the bottom right, whose name is Lucy Mercer, who had been Eleanor's social secretary when Franklin was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And Eleanor discovered love letters from Lucy Mercer in Franklin's luggage when he returned from Europe after World War I. And so this was very devastating for her. She told a friend later that it was like the bottom had dropped out of her world when she discovered those letters. And from what we know from the stories that she told friends of hers, she offered Franklin a divorce at this time. And for a number of reasons, they decide not to do this. They decide to stay together. And their lives change very significantly at this time. And so this photograph that we look at on the top, as I said, was taken after this time. And a lot of folks have kind of translated the body language here, the idea that Sarah has her hand on Eleanor's knee, she's comforting her. Eleanor very often looked away in photographs. She really didn't like having her picture taken. And this was obviously a very trying time in her life. And so I think that's a really interesting photograph. But around this time, this is, again, where things are changing for Eleanor in a lot of different ways. She decides to remain in the marriage with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin is supposedly told by his mother, Sarah, that he'll be disinherited if he divorces Eleanor. And his very good friend and political advisor, Louis Howe, supposedly told Franklin that he could never be president of the United States if he divorced his wife and left her with 5 children. And so they stayed together. Many folks over the years, authors and other people, have suggested that this becomes a political partnership after that. I don't think that's really an accurate summation of the relationship. I think that there are a lot of factors that go into what happens after this, and their feelings are very complex, as are all human relationships. But I think it's something that we can think about is that when he dies in 1945, although Lucy Mercer was present in Warm Springs, Georgia, when Franklin died, Eleanor Roosevelt was devastated when she found out that Lucy Mercer had been invited down there by their daughter, Anna. And I think that thinking about it as a political partnership, it would be kind of confusing to think about why she would be so devastated by this if it were such a relationship detached of emotion and love. I really don't think that's accurate. But they do, for their own reasons, stay together, and they do begin to find new avenues in their lives separately that help them feel fulfilled individually. And after this, after 1918, 3 years later, Franklin Roosevelt contracts polio at the age of 39. He is going to spend a lot of time in the 1920s apart from Eleanor, traveling down to the South, to Florida, where he buys a houseboat. And he's kind of trying to figure out what he's going to do next. He's trying to decide whether or not it's still feasible for him to remain in politics, which of course we know he does, become governor of New York in 1928 and president of the United States in 1933. But during this time in the 1920s, when he purchases property down in Warm Springs, Georgia, and builds a polio rehabilitation center and cottage for himself, which will later be known as the Little White House, they're spending a lot of time apart at this time. But something else that's very interesting to think about around this time period is when Franklin runs for vice president in 1920, right before he gets polio, Eleanor travels with his campaign, and she realizes around this time in the early 1920s that she has a strong interest in politics, and this is going to be part of the story as well. And so in the 1920s, after women get the right to vote, women such as Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, who we've been talking about, are doing a lot of political work in New York State at this time. And Eleanor begins to work with these women. She joins the League of Women Voters, the Women's Trade Union League, and the Women's Division of the Democratic Committee, the Consumer League. These are organizations that she joins at this time, and she's working with other women who are committed to causes such as labor activism at this time. They think that women have this opportunity now that they have the right to vote to bring change to these causes, these things that they're very concerned about. They think that women being involved is really going to help start to affect positive changes. So she's making a lot of new friends at this time, and Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman are two of those friends. And so Nancy Cook was born in New York, in Messina, New York in 1884. Marion Dickerman was born in Westfield, New York in 1890. So we see Nancy Cook on the top left, and Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook are both pictured in the bottom picture, with Marion being on the left, Nancy Cook being in the middle, and a friend of theirs on the right. And so they met at graduate school in 1912 when they were at Syracuse University. And at that time, they began to live together at that time, and they will be together until Nancy's death. Shortly before her death in 1962, Nancy will go to live in a nursing home. But up until that point, from this time on, Nan and Marion are partners in their lives. They are going to live together. They are going to go into various businesses together. And so they are life partners, something, a phrase that we would use today, and to characterize their relationship, because that's what they are. They share their lives from this point on. And Nancy Cook, during World War I, went with Marion Dickerman overseas. So this picture on the top left and the bottom are photographs when they were volunteering during World War I in London. And they were volunteering for a hospital in Endell Street in London. And they went over as nurses, but they realized that they didn't have a lot of skill as nurses. And so they began to kind of explore their individual skills at this time. And Nancy Cook, as we can see on the top left, had a skill in woodworking, and she began creating artificial limbs for World War I soldiers at this time. And so this is something that she's very interested in. And Marion Dickerman would work as a clerk, basically, at the hospital there. And so this is where their partnership is formed. But when they come back to the United States after the First World War, they are immediately getting involved in women's politics in the 1920s. By this time, Marion, right after they come back from London, Marion is going to run for state assembly, the first woman in New York to do that. And although she didn't win, this is a really revolutionary thing that she's doing at this time. She got the attention of Franklin Roosevelt. And so they're really getting involved in these causes right away. Marion becomes a teacher, Nan is a political organizer, and we're going to see them both doing this political work over the course of their lives. And so before we move on, that is how they met Eleanor Roosevelt. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But as I said, Eleanor is working in these organizations, particularly the Women's Division of the Democratic Committee. And so this is where she meets Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. She gave a speech for the Women's Division at Nancy Cook's invitation. And so after she does this, they become very good friends. There were a number of other women who were in partnerships with other women that Eleanor Roosevelt became friends with at this time. And so these women were living, again, outside of what were societal conventions at that time. Most of them were the women that Eleanor was meeting at this time were involved in politics. They were political activists. And so there were another two women who were a part of a partnership for a lot of their adult lives named Esther Lape and Elizabeth Reed. And these two women became very close friends of Eleanor Roosevelt's in the 1920s. And so we can see photos of them on this page. On the top left, this is a photo of both of them in Connecticut, where they would buy a home and live together. You can see them on the bottom right as well. And Eleanor is in Greenwich Village in the top right photograph. And the reason why I included that photograph of Eleanor in the village is because she at this time began renting an apartment in Greenwich Village in a building that belonged to Esther and Elizabeth Reed. And so in Greenwich Village at this time, Eleanor is really starting to come into her own. She is spending a lot of time with women like Esther and Elizabeth Reed, as well as Nan and Marion, and other couples such as Molly Dewson and her partner Polly Porter, who lived in the same apartment building. And so these women work for the Democratic National Committee. They're organizing women voters for FDR. And so she's seeing examples of these women who are in partnerships with other women who are achieving things that she wants to achieve for herself. And so she's obviously thinking outside of this box at this time, really starting to understand that there are things that she can do that she had never really considered before. And on the bottom left, we see a photograph of Eleanor with Esther Lape. They were involved in an event that was called the Bach Peace Prize. So after World War I, Eleanor was very interested in the idea of a League of Nations, which we know, of course, doesn't end up working out. But they were interested in the idea of kind of continuing these conversations about world peace and nations working together to achieve that. And there was a prize that was offered at this time called the Bach Peace Prize to somebody who basically could come up with a plan for world peace. And they're going to discuss this. And we see a photograph of Eleanor and Esther Lape here together when they're going and working in relation to that event and that prize in that photograph on the bottom. So Eleanor and Nan and Marion really become inseparable. By 1922, after that speech that Mrs. Roosevelt gave at the invitation of Nancy Cook, they are, after this, basically the three of them are best friends. They are spending a lot of time together at the Roosevelt home in Hyde Park. Eleanor invites Nan to come to lunch after she gives that speech for the women's division. And after that, she's also introduced to Nan's partner, Marion Dickerman. And so after this, they're working together to organize the women of New York State. They're very interested in getting more women involved in politics. And Franklin Roosevelt shares this goal as well. And so what they're going to do together is spend a lot of time with Franklin Roosevelt. They're going to spend time at the Roosevelt home. And then in 1924, the four of them, Eleanor and her husband Franklin and Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, were having a picnic at Val-Kill, which is property that was purchased by Franklin Roosevelt in 1911. And the Roosevelts used that property for picnicking. The Roosevelts love to picnic and barbecue. And so they invited Nan and Marion to come to one of these picnics in fall of 1924. And at that picnic, it's when the women in Franklin decide to build Stone Cottage, which we see an early photo of on the bottom left. And so that cottage was built for a number of reasons. It was built as a home for Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, and they'll live there until 1947 after it's completed in 1926. And it's also built as a workplace, a headquarters, basically, for the work that these women are doing for the Women's Division of the Democratic Committee. They use it as a place to come together to research local issues, support local candidates. They are editing a party newspaper for the Women's Division, and they are basically trying to encourage more women to get involved in politics. And this is kind of a home base for that work. And so shortly after they decide to build Stone Cottage, which Franklin Roosevelt offers them the property, the use of the property with a life's lease, and they put $12,000 into the building of Val-Kill, the three women. Shortly after they build Stone Cottage, they're going to build a factory that the three of them will run together. So the cottage that we come to visit today, if you come to Val-Kill to see Mrs. Roosevelt's home at Val-Kill, that building was originally a factory that was Val-Kill Industries from 1926 until 1936. And it was a furniture factory that the three women ran together. Nancy Cook was the one who suggested this, being someone who knew a lot about woodworking, as we've been talking about. And so the three women wanted to have a cottage industry, as they called it. The idea was basically to have a business together, but also a place to encourage local people to come to work to learn a new trade, furniture making, a pewter work later on. They would add a pewter forge, as well as weaving operations. And so they encourage people to come to learn a new trade at Val-Kill so that they can supplement their income in the 1920s. Many farmers in that area of New York in the 1920s were leaving for the cities. And this was something that was very concerning to the Roosevelts and their friends like Nan and Marion. And so this was meant to be a local industry to help boost the local economy. And so shortly after this, the women also decide to purchase a school in Manhattan called Todhunter School, which was a place where Eleanor Roosevelt taught and Marion Dickerman was the principal. So Eleanor taught American history and literature. She loved teaching. It was something that she did until she became First Lady in 1933. And so this place, Stone Cottage, was a place that the three women shared while the factory was in existence. They used it as a home for Nan and Marion, but also a retreat for Eleanor Roosevelt. And we can see some of the embroidered towels, the hand towels and handkerchiefs that they had with the three of their initials that were made around this time. So they were living very closely together. And Franklin called Stone Cottage the honeymoon cottage. So we can see some photographs from this time period of Val-Kill and some things associated with this time period. So on the top left, there's a photograph of Eleanor and Nancy Cook on the right, and two of the craftsmen who worked at Val-Kill. They hired two master craftsmen to come work at Val-Kill and teach the other people who came to Val-Kill these new trades in furniture making. They made reproductions of colonial furniture, and they were meant to be quality pieces of furniture. They were meant to last a lifetime. And so they were not inexpensive. And so because of this, they never really made a profit at Val-Kill Industries. They had a mail order catalog. They had a storefront for a time, but they never really made much of a profit. But we can see a stone cottage in the pool that was built for Franklin Roosevelt's use, that was also used by everybody who came to Val-Kill behind Stone Cottage. So after Franklin got polio, he really came to enjoy swimming. He felt very mobile when he was in the water, and he loved to swim. So they built this pool that was used by everybody at Val-Kill. Eleanor and Franklin, during his presidency, invited many people to Val-Kill to swim in that pool, such as Winston Churchill and King George VI, when he and his wife came to visit the United States and the Roosevelts in 1939. And so the Val-Kill property was used by both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And there's a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt that we can see on the top right, teaching at Todhunter School, which she found to be very rewarding work, which is one of the reasons why when she became First Lady in 1933, she was very concerned about what her role was going to be. She was worried that she wouldn't be able to do meaningful work anymore because Franklin told her that she could not teach after he became president. This was something that she had to give up and kind of go back to fulfilling these more traditional roles as First Lady and what was expected of the First Lady at that time, which would have been hosting luncheons and, you know, sort of filling a more traditional role at that time. And we can see Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, Eleanor Roosevelt and Nancy Cook on the bottom right. This is a photograph of them at Val-Kill together. So I thought it would be fun to show a short video that was taken by, there was a camera that was owned by Nancy Cook, so that took movies. And so that camera was often present at celebrations that they had at Val-Kill. And one of the things that the Roosevelts like to do, as we've been talking about, is picnicking. And they built a big stone barbecue at Val-Kill. And if you come to see us at Val-Kill today, you can still see it there today. And it was a place where they hosted events such as the White House Press Corps' Labor Day picnic every year. And so Nan Cook had this camera that was used, and it must have been given to a couple of people during this picnic, which was one of those White House Press Corps picnics, because we see Nancy Cook as well as Marion Dickerman in this video. So I thought it would be fun. There's no sound, but let me see. Whoopsie daisy. Hold on. That should not have happened. We can watch it this way, actually.
Are you still working on it, Danny?
Oh, can you not see it?
All I see, it's not moving. All we see is the eye anyway, the picture of
Okay.
L. Yeah,
Okay, hold on a second.
sure.
I think I know why that happened. Let me see.
Okay.
It popped open a YouTube window, which, oh, here we go. Can you see that?
Yes,
Okay, you can see the video. Okay.
yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for letting me know. I wasn't sure that you couldn't see that. So there's no sound, so we can all just watch it. So I thought that would be fun to look at because it kind of gives us a look into the things that happened at Val-Kill. So sometimes when people come to Val-Kill, they have the idea that Eleanor was at Val-Kill, Franklin was at the big house, Springwood, and that they were living separate lives and that he wasn't involved in the life that she was living at this time, which is really not accurate. Both Roosevelts came to Val-Kill very often. They both used Val-Kill as a place to bring folks during Franklin's presidency, during the 12 years that he was president and Mrs. Roosevelt was first lady. Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook were very good friends with both Roosevelts. And so this was a place where they were all really coming together and doing a lot of really interesting things. But this is kind of a more lighthearted side of their lives during this time. And so you can see the fun that they were all having at Val-Kill. And so Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman were part of this world that Eleanor Roosevelt was living in at this time as First Lady of the United States. And so I think it's really important for us to really understand these stories when we think about people, again, that are what we would consider to be members of the LGBT community today, that were always, part of these stories, and they're living in this world where they are friends with very important people like Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. And so it's really interesting to think about the way that they impacted people such as the Roosevelts and how they were impacted by them. So another person that became very important to Eleanor Roosevelt at this time was Lorena Hickok. And she was born in Wisconsin in 1893. And she went on to become an AP journalist. She was the first woman to have a byline in the New York Times, on the front page of the New York Times, and one of the very few women who was working in the Associated Press by the 1930s. And she was assigned to cover Franklin Roosevelt when he was running for president of the United States. And she then basically suggested that Eleanor Roosevelt should also be someone that was written about in the Associated Press. And so she came to cover Eleanor Roosevelt, and they became very good friends during this time and very close. And this was one of the closest relationships that Eleanor Roosevelt had throughout her life. It lasted until Eleanor Roosevelt died in 1962. And it was a very meaningful relationship for her. A lot of people over the years have discussed the parameters of that relationship, what kind of relationship it was. I always say, based on what we know from the evidence, from the many, many letters that they shared, more than 3,500 letters over the course of their lives, we can see from it that they were very affectionate towards each other. They were basically sharing a relationship that we would call a romantic one, an emotionally intimate one. We don't know the extent of what that relationship would have been to Eleanor Roosevelt, what she would have called that relationship, how she felt in the way of what, how she would characterize it or what she would label it as. And those are not really things that I'm, really trying to accomplish. That's not really the reason why we're telling these stories, is to really understand the people in Mrs. Roosevelt's life, like Lorena Hickok, that were, again, outside of the societal conventions and norms of the time, and how they were expanding Eleanor Roosevelt's mind and what they meant to her, what she meant to them. And so Lorena Hickok was someone that was so close to Eleanor that she felt that she had to give up her career as a journalist, this really extraordinary career. And she was considered to be this really, really well-respected journalist. And she resigns from the Associated Press because she feels that she can't cover Eleanor Roosevelt in an objective way anymore. And so instead, Eleanor arranges for Franklin, who also is a big fan of Lorena. He thinks that Lorena is this very talented person and a very interesting and intelligent person. And so they arrange for Hick, as she was called, to become the chief investigator for FERA, which was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And so Hick traveled down to the South, to a lot of places that were really poverty stricken, such as West Virginia during the Great Depression. And she wrote letters to Eleanor Roosevelt and told her about what she saw down there, that the poverty that people were living in, losing their livelihoods in industries such as coal mining. And so this leads Eleanor Roosevelt to make a lot of decisions in her life through the perspectives that Lorena shares with her. And so she creates the Arthur Dale Homestead Settlement Project because of these perspectives that Hick shares with her. Hick also is the one who suggests that Eleanor begin her My Day newspaper column. Hick was getting ready to write an autobiography of Eleanor Roosevelt, which she will do later on. And in doing the research for that and having Eleanor write about her day with the intention of writing an autobiography, or rather a biography later on, Hick says, well, what would be really interesting if you shared these stories with the people, the American people, and have a newspaper column. So it was her idea that Eleanor start writing My Day, which Eleanor began doing in 1936, 6 days a week, every day but Sunday, until the year that she passed away in 1962. Hick was also the person that recommended that Eleanor start having women-only press conferences. So during this time, during the Great Depression, a lot of these newspapers were letting go their female reporters. And so Eleanor Roosevelt starts holding women-only press conferences, which meant that these papers had to employ female reporters. Otherwise, they would get scooped by the other papers who did have women reporters. And so this was Hick's idea. And so Hick is expanding Eleanor's mind in all these really interesting and impactful ways. And this relationship was important to Eleanor Roosevelt for so many ways, in so many ways. And so it's really something, when we look at this relationship, again, how it changes Eleanor Roosevelt at this time. And the letters that were exchanged between them were unsealed 10 years after Hick's death. She died in 1968. And according to her wishes, those letters were sealed until 1978. So the Presidential Library has them, and you can read them. They're all available to read. And there's a book that was written called Empty Without You that discusses these letters and the context, the historical context surrounding them, so that we can understand this relationship better. And I think it's a really fascinating one, regardless of how Eleanor Roosevelt would have characterized it. The important thing is how important this relationship was to Eleanor and the ways that it changed her in all these really interesting and impactful ways. And so we see photographs of them on the screen here when they were traveling together. They traveled to places like Puerto Rico to investigate conditions for Franklin Roosevelt during his presidency. And Hick traveled with Eleanor as she did these things. As she traveled, Hick was her companion, and they spent a lot of time together during this time. And she would go on to live until 1968. She would live at Val-Kill for about a year, and she had a room in the White House where she would stay when she wasn't working for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And then she moved to Hyde Park to be close to Eleanor until Mrs. Roosevelt died in 1962, as I said, with Hick dying in 1968. And we'll talk a little bit more about her before we finish today. Another person that I really want to take a couple of moments to talk about is a person named Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray, someone who we would characterize today as a transgender person. Pauli used she, her pronouns, though, during her life. She passed away before a time when we started to have these conversations about pronouns. And so she herself used she, her pronouns. But Pauli Murray was someone who often questioned her gender. She wrote privately and to people that she was close to that she felt like a man in a woman's body. And so I'm including her in this conversation. But really, very importantly, in Mrs. Roosevelt's life, she is a civil rights activist. Pauli Murray was a scholar. She was a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer. She was what she called herself a writer. That was what she considered her occupation. And later on in her life, she became the first female African-American Episcopal priest. But they met in 1938. Pauli wrote a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt about segregation and her feelings regarding that, and her disappointment with Franklin Roosevelt for not effecting more change related to segregation in the country. And Franklin didn't answer that letter, but Eleanor was forwarded that letter, and she did answer it. And so, and she responded to that letter. She said that she understood. She said she gave Pauli some advice at the time, which was that she needed to understand that change was going to happen, but that it was going to happen slowly. And this is what characterized Eleanor's views on civil rights at this time. But by the end of her life, she becomes someone who understands that that was really not very fair for her to say, that she didn't really understand how urgent the problems that people such as African Americans in this country were facing regarding things like lynching during this time. And so she changed her mind over the course of her life because of people like Pauli Murray. And then when I was in graduate school, I wrote a master's thesis on Eleanor Roosevelt and Pauli Murray's friendship. So there's a really fascinating book called The Firebrand and the First Lady by a woman named Patricia Bell Scott that talks about this relationship. And so they became lifelong friends after this. Pauli came to Val-Kill on a number of occasions. Eleanor invited Pauli to bring along some of her family members to Val-Kill to stay there. And so this is a really important relationship for them. There's a fascinating oral history that was done in the 1970s that Pauli gave regarding this relationship, talking about their friendship and how she said it was a learning and growing relationship. She said sometimes it was a painful one, eye to eye, but she said it was a learning and growing and loving relationship. And so this is a really important one to discuss when we talk about the people in Mrs. Roosevelt's life, like Pauli Murray, who had partners that were women. and again thought of herself in some ways outside of these ideas of the traditional gender ideas at that time. And later on, Polly helped found the National Organization for Women, and she authored a legal draft that was used in the creation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And she has been cited by people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg as being really transformative and revolutionary in relation to women's rights. Polly coined the phrase Jane Crow in relation to Jim Crow, but the way that Black women were particularly discriminated against, and there was this intersection of the discrimination that Black women faced as both Black people and women. And so she was really a very revolutionary person that helped expand Eleanor's mind in a lot of ways. She came to Val-Kill on a number of occasions, but they only took one photograph together. And so this is such a great photo. We see it on the top right. And that photo was taken shortly before Mrs. Roosevelt's death when Polly visited Val-Kill. It's the only one ever taken of them together. I'm so glad it exists. And at that meeting, that last meeting together, Eleanor asked Polly for a favor for the first time. She asked her to get her a glass of lemonade, and Polly said that she knew that Mrs. Roosevelt's health was failing at that time, because she never would have asked her to do something like that in the past. She always would do things for herself, and that was the first time she'd ever asked her to do anything for her. And she said she was so glad to be able to do something even as small as get her a glass of lemonade, because of all the things that she had done for Polly over the years. So when we talk about the legacy of the people that we've been talking about today, we've kind of touched on some of these things that happened in their lives. Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman moved to Connecticut, to New Canaan, Connecticut, where they spent the rest of their lives after 1947, when they sold their share in the Val-Kill buildings to Mrs. Roosevelt. And they decided to move to New Canaan, where they bought a home and lived together until Nancy Cook went into a nursing home shortly before her death in 1962. There's a photograph of them during these later years on the bottom left, taken in their garden in their home in New Canaan. And Nancy Cook continued to be a gardener after she moved to New Canaan. She was the one who created the gardens at Val-Kill, and she continued to do this. And she was a very celebrated gardener when she moved to Connecticut. Marion Dickerman became head of the education department in Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. So she continued her work in education. And so she died in 1983. Because she lived so much longer than the other two women. She was the one who kind of carries on and disseminates their legacy. She's the one who writes a book or contributes to a book on their life and their world together at Val-Kill, which is written in 1974. It's called Invincible Summer. And that is a really, really interesting book that we can see on the top right there about this time period and the world that they built together at Val-Kill. And I highly recommend it to anybody that hasn't read it. It's a lot of information that we have that we share at Val-Kill about that picnic in 1924 and the factory and the things that happened at Val-Kill. And there's some really great photographs in there too from that time period of the many people who visited Val-Kill. And so they're buried together in Westfield Cemetery in Westfield, New York, as we can see in the bottom right. And Lorena Hickok passed away in 1968. And she lived in Hyde Park for the rest of her life. So when she passed away in 1968, she was not doing well financially. Eleanor Roosevelt had tried to help supplement her income over the years, but she had bad health over really probably 2 decades of her life. She had diabetes, which became very bad later on in her life. And so she had trouble working because of that. But she did continue to write. She wrote biographies of both Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. And she worked on a book called Women of Courage with Mrs. Roosevelt together. But when she died in 1968, her ashes went unclaimed and unmarked until 2000, when her ashes were discovered by a local resident of Hyde Park. And this person felt that it was really a shame that Hick had not been given a proper resting place and a marker, a grave site where people could come to visit her. And so in 2000, these number of people in residents of Hyde Park, as well as the author Blanche Wiesen Cook, who wrote a 3-volume biography on Eleanor Roosevelt, had a ceremony to unveil this new marker for Hick in Rhinebeck Cemetery, not too far from Hyde Park. And so, as I said in the beginning of the program, I think one of the main reasons why we're telling these stories is so that we can understand the impact that people like Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman and Lorena Hickok and Pauli Murray and the folks that we've been talking about, the impact that they had on the world that they lived in. And so, because these stories have very often been obscured by the lack of primary sources, very often, as it was in the case of Marion and Nan, their correspondence was not passed down, it was destroyed. And so we're not able to look at those resources. And because of that, very often these stories have been obscured or underemphasized. But these people were so important in the world that they lived in, and they impacted the world that they lived in such significant ways. And Eleanor said, she wrote in her autobiography, "My friends are responsible for much that I have become. Without them, there are many things that would have remained closed books to me." And so these relationships, these friendships and the relationships that she had that with these people really make it possible for her to accomplish the things that we admire her for today. She was First Lady for 12 years, appointed to the United Nations in late 1945 by Harry Truman, served as chairwoman of the Human Rights Commission on the UN, and between 1946 and 1948 helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we can see on the bottom right. And Eleanor called that my most important task. And so that was something that was adopted by the United Nations in 1948 after those 2 years of work that she and the United Nations did to draft that document. After John Kennedy was elected, she was appointed by Kennedy to head a presidential commission on the status of women in 1961. But unfortunately, by that point in her life, she was not able to serve because of poor health. But she, by the 1950s, was hosting civil disobedience workshops and meeting with folks such as Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and being very involved in the civil rights movement and in the causes that she was concerned about, beginning in the 1920s, women's rights, labor rights, and civil rights. And she does this work until her death in 1962. She passes away in New York City at the townhouse that she owned with her friends David and Edna Gurevich. She passes away on November 7th, 1962 at the age of 78, and was buried 3 days later with her husband in the Rose Garden at Springwood. And so there's a lot of reasons why we're telling these stories. We talked about at the beginning of the program, and we're really hoping that people are focusing on these stories and understanding why these stories are so important, why it's important for us to tell these stories, and to encourage people to listen to them, to think about them, to consider them within the context of the history where they belong. And so this is something that's a goal of mine. It's a goal of the Park Service in general. And if you come to Val-Kill, we tell these stories at Val-Kill. You can see on the top right, this is Roosevelt's cottage, which was the factory for 10 years. And if you come to Val-Kill for a tour, we take you inside Mrs. Roosevelt's home there, and we talk to you about these stories in the context of the place where so many of them happened. And Eleanor loved Val-Kill. It was a place that she said she came to find herself and grow. She said, at Val-Kill, I emerged as an individual. And so this is such an important place for Mrs. Roosevelt. And there are so many people involved in the history at Val-Kill that brought about that history, that changed the history of Val-Kill, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt. And so we really want people to be thinking about those stories within the context of this larger history of Mrs. Roosevelt's life and the history of Val-Kill. So that's the end of my presentation. I think we can open it up for questions.
Oh, Danny, thank you so very much for that fascinating and informative presentation. I can't tell you how enlightening it has been for, I think, most of us. I only saw one question or comment question in the chat room before anybody else speaks. And that was Pauli, one of the lawyers that Dahlia Leftwich mentions in her book, Lady Justice. Do you know anything about that?
I don't. I'm going to open up the chat window. I have not read that book. So okay. Thank you for mentioning it. I would imagine that if it's about women and civil rights and taking place in this time period, really in the 1950s and 60s, very likely that Pauli Murray was a person that was mentioned, but I've never read that book.
Okay, it's called Lady Justice. And if anyone in the audience has heard of that book or her, please don't hesitate to tell us. And now, if there are any other questions, I think Jennifer has unmuted everybody. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
I think I see one in the chat. Did you know that there was a series of mystery books set in the Roosevelt White House? Yes. I don't know if everybody else here if anybody here has read any of those books, but her Eleanor's son, Elliot Roosevelt, wrote those books. So
I
there
have
were a
a quick
number of
question,
them.
if I may, Danny.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
You said you did your thesis on this topic. What was the most interesting, unexpected fact that you found out in doing your research?
The fact really, the thesis that I wrote and the relationship that I learned about between Eleanor Roosevelt and Pauli Murray was really really eye-opening for me. I knew, of course, that Eleanor Roosevelt was someone who was an extraordinary person that had been involved in these causes, but I really didn't understand that it was the relationships that she had with people like Pauli Murray, like Mary McLeod Bethune, that she said was responsible. These relationships were responsible for her transformation. And so it was really interesting to me to think about someone like Pauli Murray, who was much younger than Eleanor Roosevelt, to have this impact on her. She invited people like Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray was invited to come stay at Val-Kill, and Eleanor had this correspondence, with Pauli Murray. And when you look at the correspondence, it's just so it fills in so many gaps. It was really, a way for me to really start to understand how she got from point A to point B. So I always wondered, how did she go from being this person that was raised in this environment where even when she was younger, she kind of espoused some ideas that we might consider to be anti-Semitic today, some kind of very, ideas that she had been raised, in this environment to believe, in these ideas of prejudice. And yet at the end of her life, by this point in her life, she has discarded a lot of these ideas. So she says, that quote where she says that she learned about these things in her life through her friends, to actually happening. It was really so fascinating to see. After she meets Pauli Murray talks to Eleanor about things like tenant farming, problems that are going on in the country. And you can literally see Eleanor Roosevelt, after she meets with Pauli Murray, writing in My Day, like the next day after Pauli sends her a letter about, things like sharecropping and lynching. The next day or the next week, Eleanor writes in My Day about these causes. So she's literally having her eyes opened to these issues by people like Pauli Murray. And so it was really just amazing for me to see how, a person can be changed through her friendships and relationships. And so that's why I decided to write my thesis on Eleanor and the civil rights activists that she knew, because they made her really change so much over time into this person that we all admire today.
There are some other comments in the chat room. Do you see them?
Yes. How many of the local people in the area studied at Val-Kill Industries, and did any develop ongoing businesses? Yes. So they, Eleanor and Nan and Marion, they hired 2 master craftsmen that were the people kind of in charge of day-to-day operations at Val-Kill. Although Nancy Cook was president of Val-Kill Industries and was basically the boss, they had people who were kind of supervisors there, and then people who worked under them. And so they had these folks that were in charge, and then local people that were generally younger people. They were people who had were trying to learn a new trade, maybe recently graduated from high school. And so there were probably somewhere around a dozen people working at Val-Kill in the factory at its high point. And then when they added the pewter forge and the weaving operations, there were a number of other people that were involved in that. And after they closed Val-Kill Industries in 1936, one of those master craftsmen was allowed to purchase the equipment used for furniture making. And he did go on to continue using the Val-Kill name to make furniture for a number of decades after Val-Kill Industries closed in 1936.
Okay. There's another question there in the chat about someone who had unfortunately came in late. And I know this is not recorded. So is there any other, are you giving any other of these presentations?
It
down
actually
the
is
road?
recorded.
Oh,
It is being
good.
recorded. I'll
Oh,
post it to the
terrific.
library website and to our
Thank
YouTube
you.
channel on Saturday.
That was great. If you don't mind, do you mind, Danny, that it was recorded?
No.
Oh,
And
good.
in fact, would I be able to access that video too? So that I could,
100%,
so that I
yep.
could see it? Oh,
Sure.
great.
And I'll send you a copy as well.
I had
Okay.
actually meant to record it if I was able to, but then I think I noticed that you were recording it. So yeah, that's
I
great.
didn't notice.
Yeah,
So-
that's great. So
So
yeah,
the
for anybody
person who
interested.
asked about that, in a few days, perhaps within the week, you'll be able to catch the recording. Okay. Are there any
Yeah.
other? That's terrific. Thanks, Jennifer. Are there any other questions? I just would want to mention too what I talked about earlier before we started the program. Would you mind telling people again, participants, how close to Val-Kill is, or to the to Hyde Park and to the Roosevelt Museum and Home? I think they might like to hear that too.
Yeah. And also something I'm going to do that I meant to do. I'm going to share my screen again really quickly because I want people to be able to email me.
Great.
Yeah, so I have my email address on the screen here for anybody who would like to email me. So please, if you have other questions, think about that you'd like to ask me, please don't hesitate. You can email me there at my government email address.
We really appreciate that.
Yeah, so Val-Kill is about 2.5 miles away from the home of Franklin Roosevelt, which is located on Route 9 in Hyde Park. And so at the home of Franklin Roosevelt, if you go there, you go to the visitor center there and you get tickets for the home of Franklin Roosevelt, and as well as the presidential library. So the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum is also located at the same site where the home of Franklin Roosevelt is. And then Val-Kill is 2 miles away, 2.5 miles away, and it was Roosevelt property. So when the Roosevelts were living, especially when Franklin Roosevelt was living, they had about 1,600 acres of property. And so Val-Kill was on the Roosevelt property along with Springwood, the big house. But after Franklin Roosevelt died, a lot of the land started to get sold off. So now we have these 2.5 miles in between us and the home of Franklin Roosevelt. But if you come to see the home of Franklin Roosevelt and you go to the visitor center there, they will direct you to Val-Kill if you're having trouble. But you can also just go on Google Maps and put the home of Eleanor Roosevelt, and then it'll take you there. It's on Route 9G, so it's basically parallel to where the home of Franklin Roosevelt is. It's basically parallel on Route 9G and Route 9, which is where the home of Franklin Roosevelt is. So probably about a less than a 10-minute drive.
Terrific. Well, thank you again so very much. And I think we will bring this program to a close. And as Danny so kindly offered, if you have any other questions or comments, she gave you her email address, and you can contact her or contact me. Either one works fine. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening and keep cool. I hope you don't lose power. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you so much, everyone.